10 days without speaking a single word, only hand signals and complete silence moving through swamps, so dense you could not see 3 feet ahead. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden had already completed Army Ranger School, Raider School, and every elite course the United States military could offer yet during those 10 days alongside Australian operators. He learned more about surviving in the jungle than in all his previous training combined. When it ended and the Australian SAS finally broke their silence, Hayden said 2 words that echoed through classified briefings for years. "We are amateurs." Those words forced American commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been approaching the war the wrong way. What the SEALs saw in a small group of Australians was not simply better soldiers, but something entirely different, something that could not be taught in a classroom, duplicated in a manual, or mass-produced in a pipeline. The Pentagon would spend years trying to capture what the Australians possessed, and would ultimately fail February 1966. The Mekong Delta stretched before SEAL Team 1 like a maze of green waterways and mangrove swamps. Villages stood on stilts above muddy water, and somewhere in that thick vegetation, the Viet Cong waited. The SEALs had recently arrived in South Vietnam, operating from Na Bi Base near the Rong Sat Special Zone south of Saigon. They were confident, and they had reason to bet a naval special warfare community traced its roots to the underwater demolition teams of World War II, who cleared obstacles at Normandy and across the Pacific. The frogmen of Korea refined maritime raids along hostile coasts. In January 1962, after President John F. Kennedy called for expanded unconventional warfare capability, the Navy formed SEAL Teams 1 and 2, sea, air, and land operators prepared to function anywhere. Training was brutal. Buds evolved from the conditioning programs created by Draper Kaufman Hellweek, separated those who would continue from those who would quit. 5.5 days of constant exertion with almost no sleep, followed by Army Airborne School at Fort Benning and advanced SEAL-specific instruction from veterans already blooded in combat, but none of that prepared them for the jungle. The ocean was not the swamp, and the Viet Cong were not defending beaches. In early 1966, SEAL platoons deploying to the Rong Sat learned through loss what worked and what did not. 14 to 16 men, sometimes divided into smaller squads conducting direct action against an enemy who knew every creek and hidden trail. The Viet Cong called them the men with green faces because of their camouflage paint and placed bounties on them. Fear existed, but fear is not the same. As Respect Roger Hayden arrived with his platoon and immediately recognized a problem. In the underwater demolition teams, you simply did not develop the fieldcraft required to track people through jungle. They flew into a Vietnamese base near the U Minh Forest, now U Minh Thuong National Park, and began operating the same day with no transition, no briefing on terrain. The forest was dense mangrove, broken by small rises, channels winding through vegetation, so thick daylight felt dim even at noon. It was ideal ambush country. The SEALs lacked reliable intelligence. They operated what they later called dartboard missions. Throw a dart at the map, go where it lands, hope to find the enemy. Before the enemy finds you, courage was not the issue, nor was weaponry. By 1967, they carried Stoner light machine guns, shotguns, M16 rifles, CAR-15 carbines, Swedish K submachine guns. They could unleash enormous firepower. The issue was being seen first riverine. Tactics improved rapidly, light and medium. SEAL support craft inserted teams, helicopters supported assaults. Ambushes along canal banks became deadly. Intelligence gathering grew sophisticated enough that SEALs were integrated into the CIA Phoenix program targeting Viet Cong infrastructure. Yet deep in the jungle, something more fundamental was missing: invisibility. That is where the Australians entered the story. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in 1966, about 120 men from a nation many Americans barely Considered significant in military terms, the SASR had formed in 1957 at Campbell Barracks in Western Australia, modeled after the British SAS. Their experience in the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960 and the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo from 1962 to 1966 sharpened their jungle warfare skills. American units measured success through territory and body counts. The Australians pursued psychological dominance. American forces often maneuvered in company or battalion strength with artillery and air support. Australian patrols moved in 5-man teams, operating for weeks without resupply. American liaison officers expected disaster. Instead, 5 men would ambush a Viet Cong company, eliminate a dozen soldiers, and vanish without casualties. Intelligence patrols spent weeks behind enemy lines without detection. Kill ratios climbed beyond 30 to 1, but the numbers were secondary. The psychological impact was decisive. Captured documents revealed Viet Cong units refusing to patrol areas where Australians had been reported. They called them jungle ghosts. Morale collapsed not from destruction, but from fear. Late 1967 or early 1968, Roger Hayden joined an exchange with the Australian SAS in the Mekong Delta. By then, SEALs operated from bases like Seafloat and Solid Anchor, conducting constant missions. They were skilled, yet Hayden believed improvement was possible. He invited an Australian patrol into his sector for 10 days. He received an education that reshaped his understanding. From the first step, the Australians imposed total silence, 10 days without spoken words. Communication occurred only through subtle hand signals. Movement was slow, deliberate, almost geological. Where SEALs might travel kilometers in an hour, the Australians might require hours to cover 200 meters, stopping to listen, to smell, to study faint disturbances in vegetation. They modified their boots, replacing hard soles with strips of tire rubber shaped like local sandals. Their footprints resembled Vietnamese ones. Equipment was minimal. Every item justified its weight. They did not merely avoid noise, they dissolved into the jungle. On the third day, they set an ambush overlooking a courier trail. 4 Australians vanished into brush that seemed too thin to conceal a man. A scout examined the ground, reading it like text Hayden could not interpret. 11 hours later, 2 Viet Cong entered the kill zone. The Australians used knives, ending the encounter in seconds without a gunshot audible. Beyond 50 meters, instead of extracting, they remained motionless. 6 hours later, a 7-man search team arrived. Investigating the missing couriers, they found the bodies arranged upright against trees, eyes open, weapons resting across laps, an ace of spades card tucked into each collar. The search team panicked, firing blindly, then retreating in fear. The Australians never revealed themselves. Psychological warfare delivered without a word. Over the remaining days, Hayden learned to read. Disturbed vegetation estimate. Time of passage count numbers. He learned techniques for crossing open areas without silhouette, for masking scent, for controlling breathing. He observed Australians identify diet smells, gun oil, even blood from hundreds of meters downwind. He learned patience of a different order, waiting days for a single opportunity. On the 8th day, a Viet Cong patrol passed within 20 meters. The Australians had sensed them before sight or sound through subtle shifts in jungle rhythm. Hayden lay frozen for 40 minutes unnoticed. Afterward, the patrol leader whispered his first words in 8 days. Your breathing gave you away. Slow it, become part of the ground. When the mission ended, the Australian sergeant told Hayden, You SEALs are excellent in water, but the jungle is different. It only cares if you belong. Hayden responded with the phrase that would circulate in classified circles. We are amateurs, not an insult, but acknowledgement. The exchange program continued through the war, including New Zealand SAS soldiers. American forces respected the Australians, yet struggled to replicate them. Tactics could be copied, psychology could not. Between 1966 and 1971, about 580 Australians, served in the SAS in Vietnam. Their losses were minimal, while they eliminated roughly 600 enemy, achieving the highest kill ratio of any Allied unit. The impact was psychological. Entire Viet Cong units became ineffective, simply avoiding areas of Australian activity. American studies after the war concluded that small, highly trained units achieved superior results, that indigenous tracking methods outperformed technology, its psychological operations could produce strategic outcomes, and that some Australian practices would have violated American directives. Those findings remained classified. American Special Operations evolved SEAL platoons, refined ambush tactics, intelligence gathering, and indigenous cooperation. By war's end, 48 SEALs had been killed, and estimates placed enemy losses inflicted by SEALs near 2,000. 3 SEALs received the Medal of Honor: Lieutenant Bob Carey, Lieutenant Tom Norris, and Engineman Second Class Michael Thornton. Yet the distinction persisted. SEALs were elite specialists. Australians were predators shaped by different foundations, including Aboriginal tracking knowledge, refined over tens of thousands of years, and traditions of small, unique colonial warfare. The Australians approached the jungle as inhabitants rather than visitors. They carried little firepower, relying on invisibility. SEALs leveraged overwhelming force, supported by helicopters, artillery, and airstrikes. Australians planned around terrain and psychology rather than logistics and extraction. They inserted quietly on foot, sometimes taking days to reach objectives, maintaining radio silence for weeks. Both forces were elite, both effective, yet optimized for different contexts. The Australian method produced psychological dominance, making enemy units combat ineffective without annihilation. American commanders wanted to scale that effect, but could not. The cultural conditions were different. American forces were designed for global deployment, scalable structures, and technological superiority. Australian SAS operated small, selective, deeply specialized. Roger Hayden completed multiple tours, became an instructor, and passed on lessons learned. He never forgot those 10 silent days. He understood that some transformations exceed institutional training. Some skills arise from culture, history, and mindset. The Viet Cong had fought French and Americans. Yet when they encountered Australians, they faced foreigners who navigated jungle more fluently than locals. That incomprehensibility generated terror. The meeting between US Navy SEALs and the Australian SAS in Vietnam demonstrated that elite status depends on context. Different does not mean superior or inferior. It means adapted to distinct conditions. SEALs incorporated what they could: improved fieldcraft and patience, but remained fundamentally American operators. The Australians remained something else: hunters, shaped by unique intersections of indigenous knowledge, colonial experience, and psychological doctrine. When Haddon said, "We are amateurs," he was not diminishing SEAL courage or professionalism. He was recognizing a gap between operator and predator, between fighting in the jungle and belonging to it. The Vietnam War ended for Australia in 1971 and for the United States in 1973 with the fall of Saigon in 1975. The lessons from those jungles influenced special operations. For decades, the Australian SAS went on to serve in East Timor, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The Navy SEALs expanded globally, earning renown across numerous conflicts. Veterans who shared those 10 days remember. They recall silence 5-man patrols that erased larger enemy units' footprints, that looked local men who vanished in brush. They should not conceal a rabbit. They remember jungle ghosts. United States never produced its own jungle ghosts, not because of lack of skill or bravery, but because some capabilities emerge only under specific cultural and institutional conditions. Some transformations cannot be engineered. The Australians were not better soldiers. They were different creatures. In Vietnam, where psychological dominance outweighed conventional strength, that difference altered the battlefield. We are amateurs. 2 words reflecting humility, respect, and recognition that excellence takes many forms. Sometimes understanding the difference is the first step toward becoming better within your own path.